The morning sun spilled through the streets of a bustling Louisiana town, casting long shadows across the pavement. As John Neely Kennedy, the U.S. Senator from Louisiana, born in 1951 and a prominent Republican, stepped out of a modest sedan and approached the glass doors of a local bank. Known for his folksy charm and razor-sharp wit, Kennedy had served as the state's treasurer before his election to the Senate in 2016, earning a reputation as a fierce advocate for his constituents. Today, dressed in a plain suit that belied his stature, he was here for a routine personal errand, his presence unnoticed by the hurried passers-by and the chaotic crowd inside. The bank's lobby was a whirlwind of activity lines snaked through the room. Customers grumbled about delays, and the air buzzed with the clatter of keyboards and the sharp tones of stressed tellers. Kennedy slipped inside, his eyes scanning the scene with a quiet intensity, his briefcase in hand as he blended into the background, content to observe for now. Just outside those same glass doors, Emily Dawson, a woman with Down syndrome, paused to take a deep breath, her heart fluttering with a mix of nerves and pride. She clutched a folder of documents, her fingers tracing its edges as she stood under the warm morning light, steeling herself for a moment she'd been preparing for months. Her small apartment, a cozy sanctuary adorned with family photos and colorful sticky notes, had been her staging ground that morning. Each note bore handwritten reminders: check ID, bring proof of address, smile, a testament to her meticulous effort to open her first savings account, a milestone earned through countless shifts as a server at a local cafe. For Emily, this wasn't just about money. It was a declaration of independence, a bold step to prove her capability in a world that often looked at her with doubt or pity. Inside her apartment earlier that morning, Emily had stood before her mirror, her reflection framed by the soft glow of a single lamp. She wore her favorite blue jacket, a birthday gift from her mother, its familiar weight, a comfort against the butterflies in her stomach. On her desk lay a notebook, its pages filled with carefully penned instructions, each line accompanied by small doodles of stars and check marks that marked her progress. She'd spent weeks perfecting the application form, double and triple-checking every detail against the bank's online guide. "You've got this, Emily," she whispered to herself, her voice steady despite the nervous energy coursing through her. She flipped through the notebook one last time, reviewing the steps she'd memorized: bring her identification, proof of address, and the completed form. Each page was a labor of love, a roadmap to this moment. And as she tucked the notebook into her folder, she felt a surge of pride. This account wasn't just a financial step. It was proof she could navigate the world on her own terms, a rebuttal to every whispered doubt or sidelong glance she'd endured. She glanced around her apartment, taking in the familiar comforts: the knitted blanket draped over the couch, the potted plant she watered with care, the stack of books she read slowly but with fierce determination. This was her space, her haven, and today she was stepping out of it to claim a piece of the world beyond. With a final deep breath, she locked the door and headed to the bank, her steps purposeful, her folder held close like a talisman. The streets were alive with the morning rush cars honking, pedestrians weaving through crosswalks, but Emily kept her focus, mentally rehearsing her words. "I'd like to open a savings account, please." She'd practiced for days, standing in front of her mirror, repeating the phrase until it felt like second nature. The bank loomed ahead, its glass facade reflecting the sunlight, and Emily's heart raced with anticipation. She pushed through the doors, stepping into a chaotic scene that hit her like a wave. The lobby was packed, the lines stretching toward the back, customers muttering complaints about the wait. The air was thick with the sounds of ringing phones, tapping keyboards, and tellers barking instructions. Emily clutched her folder tighter, feeling the weight of curious glances from those around her. Some looks were fleeting, others lingered with a mix of pity or judgment. but she squared her shoulders and joined the line, refusing to let the stares shake her resolve. As she waited, her eyes briefly caught those of a man in a plain suit standing near a corner, his gaze sharp yet unobtrusive. It was John Kennedy, observing the room with the quiet intensity of a man accustomed to reading situations. But Emily, unaware of his identity, focused on her goal. She counted the people ahead of her, her fingers tracing the folder's edges to steady her nerves, her mind replaying the steps she'd memorized. The line moved slowly, each minute stretching into an eternity. But Emily held her ground, her determination unwavering. She thought of the months she'd spent saving, the late nights at the cafe, the careful budgeting that had brought her here. This account was her proof, not just to herself, but to the world, that she was capable, independent, and worthy of respect. When her turn finally came, she stepped to the counter, her pulse pounding like a drum. The teller, Brittany Stanton, looked exhausted, her eyes barely lifting from her computer screen. "What do you need?" Brittany asked, her voice flat and laced with impatience. Emily offered a shy smile, hoping to ease the tension. "I'd like to open a savings account." "Please," she said, sliding her folder across the counter. Her hands were steady, but her heart thumped as Brittany snatched the documents and flipped through them with a speed that felt dismissive. The teller's face twisted into a scowl, her finger jabbing at the form. "This is wrong," she said, pointing vaguely at two sections. "Here and here. We can't accept it like this." Emily blinked, confusion washing over her like a cold wave. She'd followed the bank's guide to the letter, checking every detail multiple times. "I think it's correct," she said softly, her voice wavering but firm. "I followed the instructions." Brittany sighed, shoving the papers back with a flick of her wrist. "Sweetheart, there's no point arguing. This is wrong. Come back with someone who knows how to do this." The word sweetheart stung, dripping with condescension, and Emily felt a pang in her chest. Her hands trembled as she reached for the folder, her mind racing. She was certain she'd done everything right. "But I checked it," she insisted, opening her notebook to show her notes, its pages filled with careful annotations. "I followed the guide exactly." Brittany rolled her eyes, her patience visibly fraying. "Look, you need a guardian or someone to help you. This isn't something you can just walk in and do." Emily's voice shook, but held firm. "I'm my own guardian," she said, trying to keep her composure. "I can prove it." Before she could finish, Brittany raised her voice, loud enough for the entire lobby to hear. "You're wasting my time. Let someone else handle this, okay?" The words echoed through the room, and a heavy silence followed. All eyes turned to Emily, whose face flushed with embarrassment, her hands shaking as she clutched her folder. Whispers rippled through the crowd, some laced with pity, others sharp with judgment. "She shouldn't be here alone," one customer muttered. "Why do they let people like that try this stuff?" Another hissed. Emily lowered her head, fighting back tears, her dream of independence crumbling under the weight of their stares. Brittany pointed to a chair in the corner. "Wait over there," she said coldly, already turning to the next customer. Emily shuffled to the seat, her legs heavy, her heart sinking with each step. She sat down, opening her notebook again, her eyes scanning the pages as she muttered, "I did everything right." The words were a lifeline, a way to hold on to the pride that had carried her here. Across the room, John Kennedy's expression darkened, his jaw tightening as he watched the scene unfold. He'd heard every word of Brittany's dismissal, seen the way Emily's shoulders slumped, and felt the sting of the crowd's whispers. His fingers gripped his briefcase, his mind racing with the injustice before him. He'd come to the bank for a simple task, but what he was witnessing was anything but simple. It was a failure of basic human decency, and it stirred something deep within him. Emily's hands trembled as she rechecked her documents, desperate to find a mistake she knew wasn't there. while the lobby's noise swirled around her like a storm. A few minutes later, Greg Morgan, the bank manager, approached Emily with a smile that seemed warm but carried a patronizing edge. "Miss Dawson, I'm Greg, the manager," he said, his voice smooth but insincere. "Let's have a quick chat." He gestured to a quieter table, and Emily followed. Her heart heavy but her resolve intact, she sat across from him, clutching her folder, and explained her goal. "I worked hard to save this money," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "I want to open an account." Greg nodded, but his smile faded, replaced by a look of calculated concern. "I see. But are you sure you're ready to manage an account on your own? It's complicated, you know." The question hit Emily like a punch, implying she was incapable despite her preparation. "Yes," she said firmly, her voice steadier now. "I know how to take care of my money. I've been saving for months." Greg leaned back, clasping his hands on the table. "Our protocols require a guardian's signature for situations like this," he said, his tone suggesting the matter was closed. "Why don't you come back with someone to verify things?" Emily's brow furrowed, confusion and frustration rising. "I am my own guardian," she said, her voice shaking with indignation. "I can sign for myself." Greg chuckled, the sound grating and dismissive. "Technically, yes, but we need to make sure everything's appropriate. You understand?" Emily felt a surge of anger, her hands tightening around her folder. She knew she was being treated unfairly, but the words caught in her throat, overwhelmed by the weight of Greg's condescension. Nearby, customers continued their whispers. "She doesn't even know what she's doing," one said. "This is why they need someone to handle these things," another added. The comments cut deep, each one a reminder of the doubts she'd fought to overcome. Greg stood, sighing as if the conversation was a burden. "Wait here," he said. "I'll check something." From her seat, Emily overheard him at the counter, speaking to Brittany in a low voice. "We can't waste time on this. It's obvious she can't handle it." The words were a dagger, and tears welled in Emily's eyes, though she refused to let them fall. She flipped through her notebook again, her hands trembling, desperate to prove she hadn't made a mistake. In the corner, John Kennedy shifted, his gaze fixed on Emily, then Greg, then Brittany. His jaw clenched, and he adjusted his tie, a subtle sign of the resolve forming within him. The bank's chaos continued. But for Kennedy, the focus had narrowed to one woman's struggle and the injustice she faced, setting the stage for a confrontation that would change everything. The bank's lobby was a pressure cooker, its air thick with the restless energy of impatient customers, the relentless clatter of keyboards, and the sharp, clipped exchanges between overworked staff and frustrated clients. Emily Dawson sat slumped in a hard plastic chair in the corner, her folder of carefully prepared documents splayed open across her lap, her fingers tracing the edges of the pages as if they could anchor her against the storm of humiliation she'd just endured. Her face, still flushed from the sting of Brittany Stanton's condescending dismissal and Greg Morgan's patronizing rejection, betrayed the effort it took to keep her tears from spilling over. She whispered to herself, "I did everything right." Her voice barely a breath, a desperate mantra to hold on to the pride that had carried her into the bank that morning. The whispers of the crowd around her, some laced with pity, others sharp with judgment, swirled like a venomous fog. "She shouldn't be trying this alone," one customer muttered. "Why do they let people like her waste everyone's time?" Another hissed. Emily's hands trembled as she clutched her notebook, its pages filled with stars, check marks, and meticulously written instructions, each one a testament to the months she'd spent saving her server's wages and preparing to open her first savings account. This was supposed to be her triumph, proof of her independence. But now it felt like a dream unraveling under the weight of the bank's indifference. Across the room, John Neely Kennedy, a Republican known for his razor-sharp wit and folksy charisma, stood quietly, his plain suit blending into the crowd. He'd come to the bank for a routine personal matter, but his attention was now riveted on Emily's plight. From the moment Brittany's voice had sliced through the lobby with a cold, "You're wasting my time," Kennedy had watched, his jaw tightening with each word of condescension. He'd seen Greg's feigned concern, heard the crowd's cruel murmurs, and noted the way Emily's shoulders slumped, her spirit battered but not broken. His fingers tightened around the handle of his briefcase, his mind racing as he calculated the precise moment to step in, his indignation at the injustice before him growing with every passing second. Emily, driven by a flicker of stubborn resolve, pushed herself up from the chair, her legs shaky, but her determination unbroken. She approached Greg's desk again, her folder clutched to her chest like a shield. "I've done everything you asked," she said, her voice trembling but clear, each word a quiet act of defiance. "Please, I just want to open my account." Greg, engrossed in a stack of papers, didn't even bother to look up. "Miss Dawson, I've told you already," he said, his tone sharp and final. "You need a guardian. Come back another day. Do I need to spell it out for you?" The words landed like a slap, and Emily froze, her breath catching in her throat. The lobby's noise seemed to fade, leaving only the echo of her humiliation, amplified by the curious and judgmental stares of the crowd. Her hands shook as she gripped her folder, her dream of independence slipping through her fingers like sand. She turned toward the exit, each step heavier than the last, the weight of the crowd's whispers pressing down on her, pitying glances from some, smirks of disdain from others. She was almost at the glass doors, her vision blurring with unshed tears, when a voice cut through the din, calm but resonant, like a gavel striking in a courtroom. "This has gone far enough." John Kennedy stepped forward, his presence shifting the room's atmosphere like a sudden change in the wind. Every eye turned to him, the chatter dying instantly as he moved toward the counter with deliberate, measured steps. His unassuming suit did nothing to diminish the authority in his posture, and as he reached Brittany, who was already turning to dismiss the next customer, he raised a hand, stopping her cold. "Can you explain why you're treating this customer like this?" His voice was steady, but there was an unmistakable steel beneath it, honed from years of navigating Louisiana's political arena. Brittany froze, her irritation giving way to confusion, her hands fumbling with the papers on her desk. "Sir, this is none of your concern," she said, her voice faltering, as she tried to cling to her professional facade. Kennedy removed his glasses, his piercing gaze locking onto hers, and the room seemed to hold its breath. "I'm John Kennedy, United States Senator from Louisiana," he said, his southern drawl carrying a weight that silenced the lobby. "When I see someone being treated unjustly in a public place, it becomes my concern, and it should be yours too." Gasps rippled through the crowd, whispers spreading like wildfire as customers recognized the name of the senator who'd served since 2016, known for his no-nonsense approach and fierce advocacy. Brittany's eyes widened, her composure crumbling as she realized who stood before her. Greg, sensing the shift in the room's dynamics, hurried over from his desk, his forced smile barely masking his nerves. "Senator, is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice tinged with a mix of deference and desperation to regain control. Kennedy turned to him, picking up Emily's documents from the table where she'd left them in her haste to leave. "Yes, there's a problem," he said, holding the papers aloft like evidence in a trial. "This customer brought all the necessary paperwork to open a savings account. She followed every rule, crossed every T, dotted every I. Yet you're treating her like she doesn't belong here. I want to know why." Greg stammered, his hands gesturing vaguely as he tried to deflect. "Senator, we're just following protocols to ensure everything's done correctly," he said, his voice strained. Kennedy crossed his arms, his expression a blend of disbelief and righteous indignation. "Protocols?" he said, his voice rising just enough to command the room. or prejudice dressed up as bureaucracy to make your lives easier? He opened Emily's folder, his eyes scanning the forms with the precision of a man who'd spent years dissecting legislation. He held up the application, pointing to the neatly filled sections. These documents are correct. Every box checked. Every signature in place. So why are you throwing up roadblocks? Why are you humiliating this woman in front of everyone? Brittany, now visibly flustered, mumbled, "We need to make sure she understands what she's signing. It's for her own protection." Kennedy's gaze sharpened, his tone cutting like a blade. "She followed every step you laid out, brought every document you required, and you assume she doesn't understand? That's not protection, that's discrimination. Plain and simple." His words landed like a thunderclap, and the crowd began to stir, their murmurs shifting from judgment to support. Emily, who had paused near the exit, turned back, her eyes wide with astonishment. She hadn't expected anyone to stand up for her, let alone a U.S. senator whose name carried weight across Louisiana. Kennedy's words ignited a spark within her, a flicker of courage that pushed her to step forward. "I just want to be treated like everyone else," she said, her voice trembling but growing stronger with each syllable. "I worked hard for this money. I followed all the rules. Why is that not enough?" Her question hung in the air, raw and powerful, and Kennedy turned to her, his stern expression softening into a nod of respect. "It is enough, Miss Dawson," he said, his voice warm but resolute, "and we're going to make sure you're treated that way." He faced Brittany and Greg again, his tone unyielding. "Review her documents. Right now. If they're correct, open her account. No more excuses, no more delays." Brittany, under the weight of Kennedy's stare and the crowd's growing unrest, took the papers with shaky hands and began rechecking them, her earlier arrogance replaced by a nervous urgency. The lobby buzzed with a new energy, the customers' whispers turning to voices of solidarity. A young woman in line stepped forward, her voice loud and clear. "She brought everything you asked for. Why are you making this so hard for her?" An older man nodded, his arms crossed. "They do this all the time, picking on folks who need a little extra time. It's shameful." Another customer, a mother with a stroller, chimed in. "I've seen it before. They act like it's a mistake, but it's just laziness." The pressure was mounting, and Greg's forced calm began to unravel, his hands fidgeting as he tried to regain control. "Senator, we're not discriminating," he said, his voice cracking. "We just need to ensure everything's in order." Kennedy cut him off, his voice like a whip. "Then ensure it. Stop hiding behind vague protocols, and do your job." He turned to the crowd, his presence commanding their full attention. "This isn't just about one woman. It's about a system that pushes people away because they're seen as inconvenient. That's not how we treat folks in Louisiana. And it's not how any business should operate. We're better than that, or at least we ought to be." His words, delivered with the conviction of a man who'd spent decades fighting for fairness, struck a deep chord, and the crowd erupted in applause, the sound swelling like a wave. Emily stood taller, her trembling hands steadying as she absorbed the support around her. She looked at Kennedy, her eyes glistening with gratitude, her heart swelling with a newfound strength. For the first time that day, she felt truly seen not as a woman with Down syndrome, but as a person with dreams, determination, and the right to be respected. Kennedy gave her a slight smile, a silent encouragement to hold her ground. Brittany, now under scrutiny from every angle, flipped through the documents faster, her fingers fumbling as she realized there was no error to point to. Greg hovered nearby, his attempts to smooth over the situation failing as the crowd's voices grew louder, their stories of similar mistreatment bubbling to the surface. "They did this to my grandma," one man called out. "Made her feel like she was too old to understand." A woman added, "My cousin's got a disability, and they treated him the same way. It's not right." Kennedy listened, his expression darkening as the pattern became clear. He stepped closer to the counter, his voice low but carrying the weight of his office. "You've got a choice here," he said to Brittany and Greg. "You can keep digging in, making excuses, or you can do what's right. But know this, I'm not leaving until Miss Dawson gets the respect she's owed, and I'll make sure everyone knows what happened here today." The words were a promise, backed by the authority of a senator who'd never shied away from calling out injustice. Emily's heart pounded, and the lobby seemed to pulse with anticipation. Every eye fixed on the counter, waiting for the next move, in a standoff that had become about far more than a single bank account. The bank's lobby crackled with a charged silence. Every eye glued to the counter where Brittany Stanton, her hands shaking like leaves in a storm, pored over Emily Dawson's documents for what felt like the 100th time. The air was heavy, thick with the weight of anticipation, as if the room itself was holding its breath. Emily stood just a few feet away, her folder clutched to her chest, her face a canvas of exhaustion and quiet defiance. The sting of Brittany's earlier dismissal, those cold, cutting words, "You're wasting my time," and Greg Morgan's patronizing tone still burned, but the tide had turned. John Kennedy, the senator standing tall in his unassuming suit, had shifted the room's energy with his calm, commanding presence, transforming murmurs of judgment into a swelling chorus of support. The crowd, once a mix of pitying glances and cruel whispers, now leaned forward, their applause from Kennedy's earlier stand still lingering in the air. Emily's eyes, red from the effort of holding back tears, flickered with a spark of hope, her heart pounding as she sensed the possibility of justice. Kennedy, his arms crossed, his gaze like a laser, stood resolute, ensuring Brittany and Greg felt the full weight of their actions. He'd come to the bank for a quick errand, but what he'd witnessed Emily's public humiliation, the staff's casual prejudice had stirred a fire in him. His voice, steady but sharp, had already brought the room to a standstill, and now he waited, his presence a silent demand for accountability. The lobby's usual chaos, clattering keyboards, ringing phones, restless chatter faded into a distant hum, leaving only the rustle of papers and the collective pulse of a crowd hungry for resolution. Brittany, her earlier bravado replaced by nervous fumbling, flipped through Emily's documents, her fingers betraying her unease as she rechecked every line under Kennedy's unwavering stare. Greg hovered nearby, his forced smile cracking like thin ice, his hands twitching as he tried to project calm in the face of the crowd's growing support for Emily. "Well," Kennedy said, his voice low but slicing through the silence like a blade, "are those papers in order? Or are you still gonna hide behind your excuses?" Brittany's eyes darted to Greg, seeking a lifeline, but he stood frozen, his own composure unraveling. After a tense, endless moment, she looked up, her voice barely a whisper. "The documents, they're correct," she said, the words slipping out like a confession. A murmur of relief and vindication rippled through the crowd, heads nodding in agreement. Greg, cornered, forced a nod, his hands gesturing as if to reclaim some shred of authority. "It looks like everything's in order, Miss Dawson," he said, his smile tight and unconvincing. "We'll open your account now." But Kennedy raised a hand, stopping him cold, his expression as unyielding as granite. "Hold on," he said, his tone like a gavel striking. "You don't get to sweep this under the rug with a quick fix. This wasn't a clerical error, it was a deliberate choice to humiliate this woman. I want to know why you thought that was okay. And don't give me any nonsense about protocols." His words landed like a thunderbolt, and the crowd leaned in, their murmurs shifting to a low rumble of support. Emily, emboldened by Kennedy's unwavering stand, took a step forward, her voice trembling but steady. "All I wanted was to open my account," she said, her eyes locking onto Greg's, piercing through his facade. I followed every rule. Did everything you asked. Why did you treat me like I didn't belong here? Her question, raw and unadorned, hung in the air, its simplicity exposing the heart of the injustice she'd endured. The room fell silent, her words echoing with a power that demanded an answer. Kennedy turned to her, his stern demeanor softening into a nod of respect. "You're absolutely right, Miss Dawson," he said, his voice warm but resolute. "You deserved better from the start, and we're gonna make sure you get it now." He faced Greg and Brittany again, his tone sharpening. "So let's hear it. Why did you assume this woman couldn't handle her own business? Why did you make her feel small instead of helping her like you would any other customer?" Greg cleared his throat, his hands fidgeting as he scrambled for a response. "Senator, there's no discrimination intended," he said, his voice strained, almost pleading. "We have guidelines to keep things efficient, to protect our customers. Sometimes that leads to misunderstandings." Kennedy's eyes narrowed, his voice dripping with disdain. "Misunderstandings? You call humiliating someone in front of a room full of people a misunderstanding? You call assuming she's incapable because of who she is a guideline? That's not efficiency, that's prejudice, plain and simple. And it's got no place here." The crowd erupted in applause, the sound swelling like a tidal wave, and Emily felt a surge of strength she hadn't known she possessed. For the first time that day, she felt truly seen not as a woman with Down syndrome, but as a person with dreams, determination, and the right to be treated with dignity. Brittany, her face pale, tried to defend herself, her voice faltering. "It's not my fault," she said, glancing at Greg for support. "We're told to handle customers who need more time a certain way. It's just how things work." Kennedy's expression darkened, his voice rising with controlled fury. "Need more time?" he repeated, each word a hammer striking a nail. "And because of that, you push them away? You make them feel like they're a burden instead of serving them like you're paid to do? That's not how things work, that's how you've chosen to let them work. And that choice is wrong." He turned to the crowd, his presence commanding every ounce of their attention. "This isn't just about one bank or one woman. It's about a system that's built to favor convenience over people. We've all seen it, folks dismissed, ignored, or underestimated, because they don't fit some cookie-cutter idea of who deserves respect. That's gotta change. And it starts right here, right now." The crowd's support roared louder, voices rising in a chorus of agreement. A man in line stepped forward, his voice thick with emotion. "They did this to my mom," he said. "She's older, and they made her feel like she was too slow to understand." A woman nearby nodded, her arms crossed tightly. "My cousin's got a disability, and they treated him the same way, acting like he was a problem instead of a person." Another customer, a young man with a backpack, spoke up. "I've seen it here before. They rush you through if you don't fit their idea of a normal customer." The stories poured out, each one a piece of a larger puzzle, revealing a pattern of neglect that stretched far beyond Emily's experience. Kennedy listened, his face a mix of resolve and sorrow, his silence amplifying the weight of the crowd's words. He turned back to Greg, his voice firm but measured. "You hearing this? This isn't just about today. It's about a way of doing business that's been hurting people for too long. You're responsible for letting this happen, and you're responsible for fixing it." Greg ran a hand through his hair, his composure in tatters. I acknowledge there may be practices that discourage certain customers," he said, his voice halting. "It's not written policy, but with quotas and time pressures, we sometimes make choices that aren't right." Emily's eyes widened, her voice cutting through the crowd's murmurs like a bell. "So, I'm not the only one," she said, her tone steady despite the tremor in her hands. "You treat people like me as a problem because we slow you down. Is that it?" The silence that followed was deafening, the truth of her words laying bare the bank's failings. Greg opened his mouth, but no words came. His excuses exhausted, Kennedy stepped in, his voice a quiet thunder. "She's hit the nail on the head. You've built a system that puts your convenience above your customers' dignity, and it's hurting the very people you're supposed to serve. That's not just a bad day at the office, it's a failure of character. And it's on you to make it right." He turned to Emily, his expression softening. "Miss Dawson, you've shown more courage today than most folks ever will. Don't let anyone make you feel less than you are." Emily's eyes glistened, but her smile was radiant, a beacon of resilience in a room that had tried to dim her light. "Thank you, Senator," she said, her voice soft, but carrying a newfound strength. "I just wanted to prove I could do this." Kennedy nodded, a faint smile breaking through. "And you did, more than you know." Brittany, under the weight of Kennedy's words and the crowd's scrutiny, finished processing Emily's account, her hands moving with a speed born of desperation to end the moment. She slid a receipt across the counter, her voice barely audible. "Your account's open, Miss Dawson. I'm sorry for everything." Emily took the receipt, her fingers tracing the printed words as if to anchor herself in the reality of her victory. "I did it," she said, her voice a whisper meant for herself but heard by everyone nearby. The crowd broke into applause, louder and more heartfelt than before, a collective celebration of her triumph. Greg raised his hands, trying to regain some semblance of control. "On behalf of the bank, I apologize for what happened," he said, his voice hollow, lacking conviction. "This doesn't reflect who we are. We'll review our practices to make sure this doesn't happen again." Kennedy stared at him, his gaze unrelenting. "Words are cheap," he said. "Actions are what matter. This isn't about tweaking a rule or two, it's about changing the way you see the people who walk through these doors. Every one of them deserves respect, no exceptions." Kennedy turned to the crowd, his voice resonating with a conviction that filled the room. "What we've seen here today is bigger than this bank. It's a reminder that we've all got a role to play in making sure folks are treated with dignity, no matter who they are. Respect isn't something you should have to beg for, it's the foundation of how we ought to live, work, and treat each other." The applause swelled again, a chorus of agreement that echoed through the lobby. A customer who'd earlier snapped a photo of Emily, capturing her distress, stepped forward, his head bowed, in shame. "I'm sorry for taking that picture," he said, his voice thick with regret. "I thought it was just a sad moment, but you're an inspiration, Miss Dawson. You showed more strength than I've got." Emily, caught off guard, offered a shy smile, her heart swelling with pride. Kennedy looked at the man, his tone firm but encouraging. "If you mean that, do something with it. Share what you've learned. Call out wrong when you see it. Make sure this kind of thing doesn't happen again. We're all part of the solution." As Brittany handed Emily a final confirmation of her account, the crowd's applause reached a crescendo, a wave of support that lifted Emily's spirits to new heights. She looked at Kennedy, her eyes brimming with gratitude. "Thank you for believing in me," she said, her voice soft but sincere. Kennedy smiled, his stern demeanor giving way to warmth. "It wasn't just about you, Miss Dawson, it was about everyone who's been pushed aside. You're stronger than they thought. And don't you ever forget it." Emily nodded, clutching her receipt, her heart full of a confidence she'd carry for the rest of her life. Kennedy turned to Greg one last time, his voice low but resolute. "This story's not staying in this room. I'll make sure it reaches folks who can hold you accountable. Not just here, but everywhere. Change starts now." He addressed the crowd, his words a final call to action. Respect and dignity aren't things we fight for, they're things we build together, every day. The lesson of the day was clear. Respect and dignity are universal, owed to everyone, regardless of who they are or how they're perceived. Emily's struggle laid bare the harm of systemic biases, but Kennedy's stand showed that challenging those biases through action, accountability, or simply speaking up can spark real change. The educational takeaway was a call to action. We all have a responsibility to dismantle barriers, to demand fairness, and to ensure that no one is made to feel less for being themselves. Emily's victory and Kennedy's resolve stood as a beacon, urging everyone to advocate for a world where inclusivity and respect are the rule, not the exception. As Kennedy prepared to leave, he gave Emily a final nod, a silent salute to her courage. Emily smiled back, her receipt in hand, knowing this day had changed her and perhaps the world around her forever.